Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Classroom Matters with me, your host, Christy Houle. And I am getting the opportunity to sit down for the second time today with Dr. Rick Chromey. Some of you that are listening may have already had an opportunity to listen to the first session that I did with Rick a few weeks back. And today we're going to sort of continue that conversation. In our previous episode, we dug into engagement and motivation in the classroom. And today we're going to continue that conversation, but we're really going to dive into the topic of classroom management, what that looks like now, especially during a time of COVID and all of the different learning environments. So, Dr. Rick Chromey, thank you so much for joining me again.
What a pleasure. It's always good to be with you and talk about these important classroom matters.
Yeah. So, Rick, tell us a little bit about your background. I know for the listeners that already listened to you the first time they heard your introduction, but give everybody a little brief background about who you are and the kind of work that you're doing.
Right. Well, nowadays I'm a cultural historian and inspirational edu-trainer. Those are kind of the leadership imagineer. Those are some of the fun tags people have put on me, and I've kind of adopted them as worthy labels for my work that I do. Technically, I'm a professor, an author, and trainer, life coach. I do all sorts of different types of coaching, just depending on what your needs are. But I also do a lot of work with educators, helping them to be better in the classroom and creative communication, classroom management, and also just teaching styles, our approach to teaching, and how we have different personalities and how they create conflicts in the classroom. And I'm married to a wonderful wife. She's actually a parateacher herself. I'm a online professor nowadays, thanks to just the new climate that we live in. But I miss the classroom a lot. I think that's my favorite part of teaching, was that in the classroom. I was being a professor. I worked at the university college level. So I'm not K through 12 like a lot of your listeners are. And I did work within a private Christian institution, so or faith-based. So that was a little bit different too than a lot of the rules and regulations and policies that some of your listeners, or probably most of your listeners, have to deal with.
I miss the classroom too, Rick. I really do. Like, the days of walking in and there's just that smell in the school and and the classroom. Sometimes they're good smells, sometimes not so good.
Yeah, the smells I was thinking of were not so good smells, but
yeah, I mean, talk about, the days of, and it's so different now than, 20, 30 years ago when I started my career and you were probably getting your feet, wet in education and those types of things. But it's so different now with not only the classroom setting that teachers are walking into, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school, but just the educational environment in itself, especially over the last 2 years. And in our last episode, we talked a lot about engagement, motivating kids, because if you think that was hard to do in a classroom setting, we talked about this. So folks, if you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, please go check out episode 1 of that. Talk about, and we talked a lot about how difficult it is to engage and motivate kids in a setting when you're not even with them. You're teaching remote. So let's dive into the topic for this conversation, which is classroom management. So talk a little bit about what classroom management used to look like, and what we mean when we say classroom management.
Well, I was going to pause and ask you that question, because I think for me, I've had classroom management has pretty much been fairly consistent. I stopped being in the actual classroom. I was trying to think, the last time I taught in a physical classroom as a professor was probably 6 or 7 years ago. It's just my line of work at the graduate level moved me more into online opportunities. And, if you can make your hay there, I mean, that's just a better place to work, and you can work at home and kind of work your schedule. It allowed me to do my consulting and speaking and writing and such like that. So, when I think about the changes, probably the changes that I would see were more in how, for example, technology has changed the classroom and how we have to manage around those type of distractions. I didn't have those, at least not in the early days. I didn't have kids whipping out their smartphones. A few years ago, I think it's been probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years now. Obviously, with COVID, things get kind of mushed together here. I was doing some substitute teaching at a local school, and it was interesting walking into the class as a substitute. Different teachers had different rules, and I had one teacher that wanted it. You literally had to take your cell phone and put it in a box before class started, and that was the expectation. And these kids just walked right in and did that. For me, that was different from how I would manage a class, because I really feel the technology, it's a part of their life. It's really an extension of, it's an appendage these days. And for me, I just learned my doctoral work. I learned how to use technology in the classroom in a way where it's a part of who we are. And I I'm not the sage from the stage anymore. That's the difference with teaching. But as far as the big difference, I think, is education has moved from being a sage from the stage, lecture driven approach to a more a guide from the side. We create conversations, we create experiences, we help empower. Sometimes we may have to enable the student, depending on their deficiencies, to get things done and to move
Mm-hmm.
forward towards the objectives. That's the key in education, right? It's those objectives. Are we getting those? Are we attacking those and moving forward towards those? Because if we're not, then we're not really teaching. And by the way, if we're not teaching, they're not learning. Because I always think it's interesting. One thought on teaching and learning, Christy, is that the Hebrew word for teaching and learning, if you knock off the suffix, the prefix and suffix, it's the exact same word in the Hebrew. The exact same word. In other words, if you're teaching, they are learning. And if they haven't learned, then you haven't taught. And I love that Hebrew idea for teaching and learning. So classroom management wraps all around that. And I've got some other ideas on what that looks like and how that plays out. But I'm still interested in what you think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm
You
glad that
know?
you brought up the technology piece because it does look a lot different, but I just read an article either yesterday or today, I don't remember, and it was talking about not cell phones anymore, but now how smart watches. Some folks are saying they're a distraction when students are wearing their smartwatch because, as you know, and all of our listeners know, your smartwatch aligns with your smartphone, which is usually in a book bag located not too far from the student. And so now teachers are upset, or not, maybe upset's not the right word, but concerned about the distraction with the kiddo having this device on their wrist that is pinging and dinging, and they're looking at it and, still doing that thing. But I agree with you. And I just had an episode with Stephen Anderson, who is a technology guru in the classroom. We do have to embrace technology. It's not the enemy if you are motivating and engaging your students. If
Right.
your students are learning, technology should not stand in your way. It should be your support and your
Yeah.
guide, especially with, and like you said, the kids putting the phones in the box and they just did that. That's a form of classroom management, but are their brains worried about their cell phone? Are they less distracted because they don't have it? Are they too busy thinking about it? Who knows, right? There's no right answer when you come to
Yeah.
cell phones in the classroom. I know it's a big debate, but classroom management for me has changed so drastically because when I started teaching back in 98, 99, I'm going to date myself now. It was about the Harry Wong book, and it was about,
Yeah.
spending the first 2 weeks teaching students how to get out from their desks and go stand in a line, how to go into a small group, how to all get their books closed, how to get notebook paper, how to manage the movement in your classroom, how to manage the behaviors in your room. Now, you're right. It is no more sage on the stage, or it shouldn't be. It is about student led, student collaboration, student discussion. You are the guide on the side. So it's changed drastically. And sometimes, for folks like me, luckily I've been still in the education setting long enough where it's not so startling. But if you were in that and then you walk into a classroom now and you see kids all over the place talking and learning and making noise and all these things, you kind of are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. This teacher does not have her classroom under control, but really she does, and the kids are
Uh-huh.
learning just as you mentioned. So how would you suggest to listeners, or how do you talk about managing an educational environment when you aren't even there?
Well,
Right? Because a lot of our kids are learning on their own now from home.
Right. Can I back up for just a moment and
Yeah.
give you kind of a 30,000 foot flyover here of my basic philosophy when it comes to classroom management? And that is, I think you have a choice when you walk into a classroom, whether it's online or whether it's on ground in a brick and mortar situation. And that choice is simply, am I going to be a smoke detector or a fire extinguisher here? And what I mean by that is we have a choice to create an environment where, and smoke detector, it simply sniffs the environment. It's constantly evaluating the environment for, issues that might create a fire eventually, and so you can have just heat, smoke, just a little wisp of smoke can set off a smoke detector. The problem is in education, and I've taken a few classroom management courses now in education. I've gone to a number of workshops by educators who claim to be experts in the area of classroom management and strategies for discipline in the classroom. Most of what I hear is fire extinguisher mentality. It's reactive. Here's what you do when kids misbehave. This is what you do when a student is disruptive, when they've started to disengage, and we like to use that word engaged learner when it comes to classroom management. For me, the fire extinguisher is too late. If I'm relying on the fire extinguisher as my strategy for classroom management, I've already relinquished control of the classroom to the student. A smoke detector mentality asks the bigger question: why are students really misbehaving? And I have a whole workshop on this. So for me, and I just taught it this last weekend, so it's very fresh on my mind. The reasons why students misbehave, there are some big obvious ones, that relate to, sometimes they're hungry and they're just being squirrely and stuff like that. But I think there are really three basic ones, and depending on the age you're dealing with, they can be somewhat different. The biggest one of all, I think this hits all ages, is what I call belonging issues. They just don't feel like they belong. They're not fitting into the class. There's something going on. There's a dysfunction in the classroom where the student is not connecting either with you, with your material, with other students. And so they start to disrupt, they start to disengage. And to kind of unpack that a little bit, there's a man by the name of Rudolf Dreikurs. I don't know if I can get that in the, Rudolf Dreikurs wrote a book that I found fascinating. Have you ever heard of Rudolf Dreikurs, by the
I have
way?
not. No, I haven't.
Wow. Rudolf Dreikurs wrote back in the 1950s, and I was taking a graduate classroom management course and ran across him by accident. And as I read his material, I went, this guy's got it. He's got it, because he was dealing with smoke detector understanding of why kids misbehave. He positions or proposes, and I would propose the same thing, that all human behavior is wired behind a genuine need to belong, especially socially. When we're in social situations, we want to belong. And his theory was that when you don't feel like you belong, you basically jump off into what he called mistaken goals. And it's like a ladder. And at each point, the teacher, and he proposed all sorts of ideas, and I have my own ideas on how to correct these. At each point, the teacher then can redirect and get you to go back, but it gets harder and harder and harder the higher up they go. The first level is simple attention seeking, so they don't feel like they belong, so they just start to seek attention. This is such low level behavior. It's a little bit of smoke, but the smoke detector teacher picks up on it. The fire extinguisher teacher is taught to ignore it. And I don't know how many times I've heard teachers be taught, ignore the low level
Mm-hmm.
behaviors. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Just let it slide. No, Dreikurs would say no. And what I've learned is no, you pick those up and you realize they're not belonging. They're not fitting in, and you redirect them. Sometimes it's as simple as just getting into the physical proximity of the student. With a younger child, a lot of times you just have to walk over, and I call it invading their space. Sometimes you may have to touch them on the shoulder. Sometimes you may have to say their name. All sorts of ways that you can bring them back in and re-engage them. Because if you don't do that, they move to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
The next level are power plays. And this is where a student basically says, all those little crazy things that you just ignored, I'm going to ramp it up and really bug you with them. So suddenly the tapping of the pencil becomes annoying, and it becomes a real issue for you. And of course, teachers at this point, how do we respond? with power plays.
Mm-hmm.
We respond right back with power plays. In fact, one of the greatest power plays, and I'll talk parenting as well here, but I've seen in the classroom, maybe it's not so common as it used to be when I was a kid, or maybe when you were a kid, but we would call it called timeouts. I remember as a student myself, I would literally be taken out of the class and put on a chair, sometimes in front of the class. And, I sat there until I could behave. I had to sit on the chair. Well, let me tell you, if belonging is the problem, if you don't feel like you're fitting in, do you really think that separating the child or the student from the social situation is going to fix that? Dreiker said no, and I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
It only pushes them up to the next level, and that's revenge. This is where they then personally start to attack you. And this is also where teaching gets totally miserable. I talk to teachers all the time, and they're just completely miserable. They can't figure out why this one student just bugs them and bugs them and bugs them. And we go through this process, and they realize that they allowed the fire to smolder and smoke, and then it just erupted. And of course, power plays are, again, how we respond to that. Without taking too much time, we just power play them back. And in the end, what Dreiker suggested at the very end is the student then simply says, okay, I can't win. You're going to flunk me. You win. Teacher, you win. You're more powerful than I. But that means that I just quit. And he called it resignation. They just shut down, and they sit there and they're compliant in the class. And we think as a teacher, oh, we've won. We've got them. What we've done is we've lost them not only in our relationship as a teacher student, but also in the relationship to the topic. There are a lot of students out there, including myself, that struggle with math today because we had a teacher that really didn't care that whether we learned math. They just wanted to get us through. In fact, Christy, I tell you, when I was in high school, my last math class I ever took in my life, algebra prep, I had a 12% on as my final grade. And the teacher only called my name once, and that was after I turned in the final exam without anything on it. I just turned it in. She called me by my name for the first time, and she says, Chromey, you got a 12% in my class. And I says, I know, ma'am. And, I just don't understand this. And she says, I don't want you back in my class next year. And I have to have you back in my class with this grade. So I'm not going to give you this grade. She gave me a 61% and passed me on through the system. It happens. It happened to me, yeah. And it happens all the time. And so belonging, and that's a big issue. In fact, when I look at discipline issues or classroom management, belonging is probably 80% of the problems that we have in the classroom, which makes the other two fairly simple. The second one, belonging is the first one. The second one's boredom. The student's just bored. We've exhausted their attention span. They no longer are paying attention, and they're gone. And I always say attention spans equal their age. All right. You got a 2-year-old, you got a 2-minute attention span. You got a 5-year-old, you got a 5-minute attention span. You got a 10-year-old, you got a 10-minute attention span. You got a 16-year-old, you got a 4-minute attention span because of social media. Social media among our adolescents have regrouped their attention spans. The micro media out there, the Snapchats and the TikToks and the Twitters and YouTubes have shortened their attention spans. So you as a teacher, if you're teaching adolescents, you have to keep things working and shifting. The final reason, by the way, and this is a significant one among older, I think it really emerges in preteens and adolescents, is simply beliefs. People have told us what we come to believe about ourselves. We're not as smart as so-and-so. We're never going to be as good in the classroom, or, we already know. I mean, think about it, Christy. By the time you were in 4th or 5th grade, you knew who was going to be the homecoming queen of your class. You knew who was going to be the valedictorian, and you knew who was going to be this big sports athlete. And you probably also knew that you weren't, that wasn't going to be you. And so we tend to then live down. And for those of us like myself, who was a very disruptive child, I basically learned that by acting up and acting out, I finally got people's attention. I became the class clown. That's how I got people's attention. And so it was through my disruption that I felt like I fit in. So I think what we need to do, and that's the big flyover there, and is that we need to be more smoke detector. Why are they misbehaving? Is it because of beliefs that they have that they're carrying into the classroom? Is it because they're bored? or is it because they're not fitting in? They're not belonging in the learning environment. And if you can find out which one of those is going to happen, then boy, you can actually stop and really get in the middle there and keep misbehavior from happening and keep them more engaged.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a
Well,
lot. Yeah.
yeah, it's
But
it's a lot. It's a lot of good stuff. It's a lot of great stuff. I love the fire extinguisher, smoke detector analogy. I think that's fantastic. And I think that what you're saying makes so much sense. And also to add to that is not waiting until you have an issue with a child to try to build that relationship and figure it out from day one. Those relationships should be starting, and I know a lot of schools have, meet the teacher and all those things, but, having every child walk into a classroom with a clean slate, regardless of what you had heard about them the year before, because we all know it's not a secret. Teachers talk. And where someone may have said, oh, you had Rick Chromey last year. Well, wait till you have him this year. He's this and he's that, then that teacher already has. So we have to stop doing that as educators. And we also have to be willing, I feel, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, the control issue in a classroom. Teachers need to feel better about relinquishing some of the control of that classroom setting. And I think that links back to what you talk about when you talk about belonging and authentic community is the control of the classroom. I want to hear your thoughts on that, but I have a really quick story. I'll never forget this video, and I wish for the life of me I could remember where I saw it or who did it. I saw a video once of a teacher. Very first day of school, and I believe these were probably middle schoolers, maybe early high school. I'm not sure what age group. These kids walked into this class, and the first thing that he did, he had all these tables jumbled around everywhere, tables and chairs. And he gave them one simple direction. He said, I want your job today is to put these tables in whatever formation. It was, something that he asked the kids to do. He gave them one or two simple commands, and he walked out of the room. And they all just stood there kind of looking at each other like, I guess we have to work together to get this done. And that's exactly what they did. So he really gave up most of the control of those kids, and they realized it was on them to figure this out without the teacher saying, do this, do that, you sit here, you sit there, move that table here. Most people wouldn't be comfortable to do that. But I guarantee you it made a better classroom for him that year.
And I think that's why technology, particularly smartphones, are so, let's use the word appropriately, disruptive technologies in many ways. But in the classroom, they're disruptive because they disengage the student. And, instead of using that technology to bring them together to use, for them to learn how to use their technology, we take it away from them. Mm-hmm. And, the thing is that, man, when I was a kid, when you were a kid, we all had ways of disrupting and disengaging. I mean, we wrote notes to each other. We did all sorts of little things. And, I think it's fascinating how today we seem to think this is just, the technology's changed some things, but kids are kids, and you talked about.
They're going to find a way, aren't they?
Yeah, they're going to find a way. The control, this idea of control, that goes back to, in my other episode, we talked about the 6 basic needs. And one of those needs is ownership. We're all control freaks at heart. We all want to feel large and in charge. We all want to have choice and the ability to contribute. And so when you take away choice, teachers, when you take away choice, you limit the student and basically shut down. They have a deep need to have some control themselves. So I think there's an advantage to, I call it the respect factor, the trust factor. In my classes, my students, they just knew that I started off with an implicit trust. You had to break that trust. If the trust was broken, then we dealt with that in a different way. But I wanted to trust my students to start with. In fact, are you familiar with Barbara Colarosa?
No.
Barbara Colarosa is someone who has really influenced me as well on some of these matters. She wrote a book, let me see if I can get it in here for you, called Kids Are Worth It Too. Mm-hmm. There you go. Kids Are Worth It Too. I think she's Canadian. I heard her speak, oh my goodness, probably 20 years ago now. But she said something that and in the book, she lays it out, that I put in every one of my syllabi. I mean, it was there. And I told my students on the very first day of class, these are my statements to you as a professor, as a teacher, as your instructor. there are 6 things I want you to hear from me. And these are Barbara Colorosas, but I'll repeat them for you. First of all, I believe in you. Secondly, I trust you. Third, I know you can handle this. Fourth, you are listened to. Fifth, you are cared for. And lastly, you are important to me. Now, if every student heard those 6, she called them life messages, heard those 6 life messages every single day, or most of those messages every day, and that's what I try to do. You know, when I coach people, that's one of the things I talk to them about. I know you can handle this, because that's what's debilitating them. That's what's holding them back. Students are held back too by these beliefs. And if you know they can handle it, then don't do it for them. Give them some insight, maybe give them some help, prop them up a little bit, but say, I know you can handle this.
And how much easier does it make it then on the teacher when or if an issue arises? Because it happens, right? I know that people are listening to us, and we're not, we're trying to be all pie in the sky and all these things could be wonderful, but you and I both know the reality of the situation of any organization, or anytime you have that many people together, you are going to have incidents. You're going to have children act up. You could say those things, but you're still going to have things occur. But don't you think that having those things happen at the beginning of the year, and obviously a relationship is always the foundation to all of these things, are going to make those situations so much easier to deal with than in the absence of those things?
Yeah, I call that stickiness. The ability to attract and retain, and that's what we as teachers are doing. In the higher education level, it becomes not just attracting students but retaining them for their college career. But I think in the elementary and high school classroom, it becomes retaining them to want to learn. How do you attract them? And the stickiness. And this is what's interesting. If you remember my growls, I talked about those 6 basic needs of grace, relationship, ownership, worth, laughter, and security. Those 6 basic needs, the 2 primitive needs, laughter and security, are what's at play in day 1, hour 1, week 1 of school every fall. That's what's at play. And you need to be making sure that your class is at least from a student's perspective, a safe place and a pleasurable place. And then you can work on the relationship. Now, relationships are part of that whole time as well. But the big thing, the big question that a student, especially a brand new student, is wondering in your class is this going to be a safe place for me? And is this going to be a place that's pleasing to me? That has at least a pleasure factor where I feel good at the end of the day. Because there are a lot of classrooms I've walked, surely you have, where you've had a class you went into, you thought it was going to be a great class, and by the end you were going, oh no, this is going to be terrible. And that attitude on day 1, if you have that attitude, oh my goodness, it's going to be a long year.
Yeah.
Long year.
It's so true, but it's so funny. And I think I've told this story before, but when I started my very first year of teaching straight out of college, they hired me as an overflow teacher, which means they had way too many kids in the grade level. And so they needed to add an extra teacher in September, October to take the overflow of kids. So every teacher in that grade level, I believe there were 7 sections of 2nd grade, they got to choose, the teacher got to choose 3 to 4 kids to, not lack of better words, get rid of, to give to the new teacher. So you can imagine that many years ago, what kind of classroom I walked into. Yeah. It wasn't the highest performing, best behaved children in the grade level. I can promise you that.
Right.
But I went into that not knowing, luckily for me, I was sort of ignorant to being a teacher because I just graduated and I didn't know a lot about curriculum. I didn't know a lot about the right way to teach math. I didn't know a lot, but you know what I did know was how to love on kids. And I knew how to see them each as their own individual person. And so what could have been a really awful, awful year turned out to be a great year for me and for those kids, because I just knew I did what I knew best right then. They might not have went into 3rd grade knowing everything they needed to know via book learning, but they knew that they were cared for and loved, and it was a smoother year than it could have been. So, it just goes to show you. And it's funny, those kids are now 30. I
Yeah.
believe I've been invited to some of those children's weddings. I've been invited to their graduations. I've been invited to a lot of their things. But that sticks with a person, And you mentioned something else that I want to talk to our listeners about. You talked about, the growl. You talked about making people feel respected in an educational environment, and it's no different for us. It's like if you have a job that you really respect your boss, you respect your supervisor, you want to do well, they may have to get on to you from time to time. They may have to reprimand you for not doing something, but you're not going to want to do some of the things that you talked about with these kids, the power struggles, the revenge. You're going to want to work harder for that person. And so the same rules apply in the classroom that they would apply for us, I would assume.
When you break it down, it's actually pretty simple. Just respecting other people, respecting stuff that's in the classroom, respecting other people's property. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
That's just a little tip I've learned from the trenches is that I don't call them rules. On the first day, we always talk about these are the rules of the classroom.
Right.
I think rules for those of us who are discipline challenged, you might say, that actually enjoy keeping things a little bit mucked up in the classroom. The word rule is viewed as a negative. So I've learned to use the word guideline. These are the
Mm-hmm.
guidelines that we have for learning in this class.
Yeah.
And
Were you that
and I
kid?
want
Were you really that kid? Were
I
you that
was
kid?
I was I was. In fact, I'll give you a story that comes out of my Sunday school years. Okay, because when I was in Sunday school, my life, you have to understand, my first 12 years of life were pretty hard years. I'm a short guy, so I was a short kid, and I come from the bad part of town, so to speak, and not bad meaning crime. I was from the side of the tracks where there wasn't a lot of money, and I went to a school where there were a lot of rich kids, and I just didn't fit in. I just didn't fit in. I didn't wear the clothes. I couldn't afford the nice lunch boxes and all the other things. So I just kind of stood out, and I was very much a passive kid. I just kind of would melt into the background. But in Sunday school, it was a little bit different. And because we kind of, I had some friends in there, and in preteen class, we called it junior boys back then. We decided to make a kind of a covenant together to see how quickly we could get our Sunday school teacher to quit. And it was, yeah, I can hear the groan from your listeners right now. We purposely, because that's a volunteer position, and we purposely wanted to hurt, and we were hurting kids. See, that's the thing. Hurt people, and hurt students hurt other students, and they'll try to hurt you too. And I was a hurting kid. My family was a mess. In fact, my mom was on the verge of walking out and abandoning the family altogether. There was drugs and alcohol abuse in the family. There was abusiveness as far as emotional and even some physical abuse with my father. It was pretty tough, and the first 12 years were not a good start for me. But I got this teacher in Sunday school class who decided that she was not going to let us go. Our record was 1 week, by the way. And to make them cry, if we could get them to cry, that was even better. We actually waited out in the hallway afterwards to hear what was going on after we left the class. That was terrible. I think to this day, that's why God actually took my hair. He said, fine, I'm just, and he put me in the teaching profession because he says, you're going to have to pay. This is your penance for what you did in that fourth and fifth grade Sunday school class. But, her perspective was a little bit more, because it was a Sunday school class, a church class. She pointed to Jesus on the cross. And she said to us one day, because I asked her, I said, why don't you just quit? Why don't you leave like all the others? And she said, well, he didn't quit on me. And he took a lot of nails. He took a lot of thorns, and he took he took a cross for me. So you haven't done that to me yet. So I'm going to hang in there with you. And it was at that point that I saw her in a totally different light. I
Yeah.
realized that she wasn't going to quit. And at that point, I started to behave. And she was the one that got me into writing. She saw something I wrote and she said, you make a great writer. She was the one that said to me one day, you sure talk a lot in class. You ought to be a preacher. And so I thought, no way, I want to be a preacher. But eventually I kind of gravitated towards that for a while. It's interesting how much that she influenced me.
That's it. Well, and I think that, it's such a powerful story that everybody listening is probably thinking of somebody, and we all have somebody in our life that influenced us in that way. And so it's just when you think about those kind of people that are able to do that in that type of a situation, it can't be that difficult for us to do the same thing for the people that are in our care as well, and to possibly be that person for someone else. So yeah, I mean, I think that we've come so far in classroom management. We've come a long way in using technology. I mean, my head just spins sometimes when I think back and I try to tell my kids stories of when we were in, elementary and middle and high school, and they just can't even imagine a world void of technology and cell phones and instant access to everything. But I think that, educators are doing the best that they can. They're making it work. And I only, hope to see more, positive things come out of some of the unfortunate things that we've been dealt over the last 2 years.
All right. But the power of words, and that's what I like about that. Remember, the last reason why kids misbehave are beliefs. We
Mm-hmm.
have the power to change these inner beliefs. We have the power to correct the tape that spins in their head and tells them, these type of things. See, I just expected when I went into class that the teacher wouldn't care.
Mm-hmm.
But I got to tell you, before I get that, I'm here today. I'm actually all the success I've enjoyed in life, I owe to my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Haruska. I'm going to say her name. She passed away a few years ago now. But when I was in her, her kindergarten class, Mrs. Haruska was obviously a good German woman, and she was kind of hefty, as I remember right. She was just a hefty woman, but she had a lap. Her lap was so big. It was like the size of Vermont. And, from a little guy, you just kind of think, wow. And she would put us on her lap to read books to. And I just remember feeling so safe in her classroom. But what she gave to me was a greater gift. The gift she gave to me was a belief in myself when other people wouldn't believe in me. You see, my mom went to a parent-teacher association or parent-teacher conference with her. And Mrs. Haruska told my mom, and I never heard these words from Mrs. Haruska. She may have said them to me. I don't remember them. I was too young. But my mother never let me forget what Mrs. Haruska said. And what Mrs. Haruska said was that little Ricky can do some great things when he grows up. There's something about him. He's creative. He's enthusiastic. He sometimes gets passionate about things. But and my thought now is, she was just being a good teacher, telling my mom stuff. But my mom hung on to those things, and she transferred them to me. And one of the things Mrs. Haruska said was that Ricky can be anything he wants when he grows up. Ricky can do anything he wants if he just sets his mind to it. Well, I got to tell you, 2 years later, I was sitting in a class where I had a teacher who looked at me and saw me by what I was. She put me in the box of what I was. My dad was a trucker. My mom was a waitress. We were a poor family. I didn't wear the right clothes. And she looked at me and she said, Chromey, you're always going to be a C. Just like your last name, you're always going to be a C in life. Don't you ever forget that. And, I could have accepted that. The problem is I already had another belief.
Mm-hmm.
And I just said, well, that's not what Mrs. Haruska says.
Yeah.
Mrs. Haruska said something different. She dreamed a bigger dream for me. It's true. When I was in high school, I was playing football, and I'm 5'4", and I was a hurting, bitter, angry young man by that point because of the stuff that had been dealt to me. And I just wanted to hit somebody, and I wanted to play defense. And my coaches, they said, you should be a running back. You play back on safety on defense. I wanted to play the line. And all my coaches said, you're too small to play the line. I said, that's not what Mrs. Haruska says. And I didn't say that verbally to them, but in my mind, I really believed I could do anything, Christy, anything. And to this day, it may be, at least as far as 10 years ago, I was told that I was the smallest defensive end to ever play Montana State high school football. I'm the Rudy Rudiker of Montana, if you understand the story about Rudy. I just never give up on these kids. And if you're teaching at the younger ages, the power of your words can set them for life. I have a doctorate today, and I dedicated that doctorate to Dolores Haruska because I wouldn't have that doctorate if it wasn't for someone like her believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for being with us again. I'm so excited that we were able to have you for not one, but two episodes. And for everybody listening, if you did not get a chance to listen to episode 1 on student engagement and learning environment, please take a listen to that one. We will be having yet another final episode with Dr. Chromey. That will be coming soon. So tell everybody where they can get in contact with you.
Well, you can get in touch with me at rickchromey.com or mannasolutions.org as well. That's my faith-based side of things, but rickchromey.com. You can also get me on Facebook and Twitter and also LinkedIn. Would love to connect with you.
And you can also leave comments for me alongside the podcast episode at the educate.today website. This is Christy Houle signing off. Thanks so much, Dr. Chromey.
You bet. Thank you.